Okay, good evening, and thanks very much for all coming out on this lovely evening again. Today I'm going to be discussing in more detail the talks that I gave an overview of last week. So just bear with me a second, I'll get this set up properly. Okay, so I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then I'd love to hear your questions or comments at the end of the presentation. With the Irish Free State officially only a month old at the start of 1923, it faced enormous challenges as a state, trying to gain its feet as an independent nation. Here is an image from the Sphere from January 1923, showing key Free State government members of the Free State with the title A New Ireland, including W.T. Cosgrave, Ernest Bligh, Kevin O'Higgins, Patrick Hogan, Richard Mulcahy, Desmond Fitzgerald and J.J. Walsh. The most obvious challenge faced by the Free State government was the ongoing civil war, as Republicans refused to recognise the legitimacy of the Free State. By January 1923, Republicans had little hope of winning the conflict, but continued on regardless, adopting guerrilla tactics which had proved successful against the British during the War of Independence. There were some crucial differences, though, to the guerrilla campaign waged by the IRA during the War of Independence and that experienced by Republicans during the Civil War. Firstly, the enemy on this occasion was Irish and knew the terrain as well as Republicans did, unlike the British, who were unfamiliar with the foreign hostile territory of Ireland. And secondly, a key component of any successful guerrilla campaign is dependency on popular support. Unlike in 1920-21, in most areas in Ireland, this was not forthcoming for Republicans. Liam Lynch, Chief of Staff of the anti-treaty IRA, realised military victory was not possible, writing to Eamon de Valera, the president of the underground Republican government, that we cannot hope to overthrow the enemy unless there is a big desertion or complete change of the people to our side. What I hope for is to bring the enemy to bankruptcy and make it possible for a single government department to function. In military terms, the prospects for the Free State government had improved greatly by January 1923. There was less Republican activity, key leaders had been arrested, and the anti-treaty IRA was incapable of launching any major offensive, with attacks generally confined to remote areas. A Free State military report of 21st of January 1923 commented on the Republicans. With depleted numbers, lack of resources and unified control, and almost complete ineffectiveness from a military standpoint, their policy of militant action is slowly changing to one of sheer destructiveness and obstruction of the civil government. The Free State government and its army had its own problems too. Its army had been inaugurated and mushroomed in size very quickly, with little vetting of those that were hired, resulting in an element of criminality being recruited too. Indiscipline was rife, logistics was poor, particularly outside Dublin, and as the Free State was crippled financially, National Army soldiers went unpaid for long periods. The vastly depleted anti-treaty IRA was still able to achieve military victories in 1923 in places like Cork, Leitrim and Cavan, for example, killing and arresting large numbers of National Army members in the process. There also was factional fighting within the army and between the civilian government and army. Free State Minister for Defence and Commander-in-Chief of the National Army, Richard Mulcahy, purged much of the intelligence function of the army, led by former squad member Liam Tobin, seen as ineffective and also widely believed to be responsible for the so-called murder gang killings, believed to have emanated from Oriel House on Westland Road. Mulcahy replaced those demoted with officers loyal to him, for the most part, and with members of the IRB, which was revitalised in late 1922. There also was much rivalry between cabinet colleagues Mulcahy and Kevin O'Higgins, Executive Council Vice President and Minister for Home Affairs. O'Higgins believed too much power was vested in the army, and particularly with Mulcahy, and for the remainder of the Civil War sought to supplant Mulcahy's power with his own power structure through paramilitary groups formed under his ministry, or by seeking more control for the civilian government over army affairs and decisions. While the Free State Army faced many problems, the one major, if not insurmountable advantage it had was its size. It possessed huge numbers, reaching over 50,000 by March 2023. It was able to focus large numbers in areas to mine out whole regions where Republican resistance was strongest. Here's a recruitment advertisement for the National Army, and here's an image of applicants queuing outside a recruitment office on this very street, Pearse Street, in January 1923. Despite the obstacles faced by the anti-treaty side, the first months of 1923 saw a continuation of the anti-treaty IRA's campaign to cripple the Free State economically at its birth through the destruction of communication, travel, and infrastructure networks, as outlined by Lynch to De Valera. Throughout the 26 counties, there was widespread burning, bombing, and damage of railway lines, trains, roads, bridges, buildings, including houses of those considered enemies of the Republic, either pro-treatyites or those perceived to have remained loyal to the Crown. According to Bill Cassan, the anti-treaty IRA's destructive campaign of intimidation, arson, and assassination was designed to prevent the government from functioning, to drive the landowning class, principally Protestant, from the country, and to reduce the economic life of the country to ruin, especially through the destruction of railway lines. The attacks on railway lines, bridges, and trains also prevented the easy movement of army troops and supplies. By the end of the Civil War, 291 bridges and 3 viaducts were damaged or destroyed, 103 signal cabins burned out, 419 carriages destroyed or rendered unusable, 86 engines damaged and 3 destroyed. And here's a derailed train between Dundalk and Louth and Inniskeen in Monaghan in January 1923, one of over 40 overturned trains by the anti-treaty IRA since the Civil War had started. This is an image of a passenger train on fire near Killiney Station in Dublin in February 1923. This is an illustration of the Free State soldiers watching on as a train tries to cross a collapsed bridge in Tipperary. Such was the destruction of railway lines and trains that the Free State government established the Railway Protection, Repair and Maintenance Corps, which at one point numbered 5,000 combat engineers. They were armed and equipped with armoured cars converted for use on railway lines. Here is a recovery operation in progress, with a crane being used to remove a derailed train from a railway track. Other targets for destruction by the anti-treaty IRA included businesses and key infrastructure sites. Pictured is a waterworks in Athlone, destroyed in February 1923. Following the destruction of water pumps in Portlaoise that same month, residents were forced to get their water from spring well pumps. And here's the aftermath of a landmine exploding in the shop of Edward Lee and Company in Rapp Mines. And this picture shows a scene outside the Jury's Hotel on Dane Street, an attack on the hotel in February 1923. Up to 75 anti-treaty IRA members were involved in the attack on Jury's Hotel, where the Department of Revenue was based at the time. Tax offices, regularly targeted during the War of Independence, were attacked during the Civil War too, as can be seen here from the damage a landmine caused to this Customs and Excise office in Dublin, with the graphic newspaper claiming 2 men were blown to pieces by the explosion. Far more so-called big houses, seen as the physical symbol of British conquest and colonial oppression, were burned during the Civil War than the War of Independence, almost 200 compared to under 100, according to Terence Dooley. Here's a map from the Atlas of Irish Revolution showing the number of big houses burned per county in 1922 and 1923. While the anti-treaty IRA was responsible for the burning of many of them, Free State supporters were also involved, as were people with personal and social gripes, primarily relating to land. Dooley contends that more were destroyed during the Civil War because of the almost complete absence of all forces of law and order in the countryside following the withdrawal of the Crown forces in 1922 and the disbandment of the RIC. Some of the big houses destroyed by the anti-treaty IRA were abandoned houses, such as Mitchelstown Castle in Cork, which had been used as an anti-treaty IRA barracks and destroyed when forced to evacuate as Free State troops approached. Others were targeted as reprisals for the Free State's execution policy of Republicans. Free State senators, some of whom came from landowning and unionist backgrounds, were specifically targeted by the anti-treaty IRA when its GHQ issued an order in January 1923 stipulating that houses of Free State senators were to be burned as reprisals for executions of anti-treaty I prisoners. The 7th Earl of Mayo, Dermot Burke's mansion, Palmerstown House in Stratton in Kildare, was burned in retaliation for the execution of Republican prisoners in January 1923. 7 men had been executed in the Corra camp the previous month. And here's the mansion in ruins. Mansion of Sir Horace Plunkett, also a senator in Foxrock, was destroyed too. Here you can see the ruined premises and an internal view showing the extent of the damage. On being informed that his house had been destroyed, Plunkett replied, "It is not so sad as if it had been a poor man's one ruined house." The mansions of Senators Sir Thomas Esmond in Wexford and Maurice Moore in Mayo were also destroyed in early 1923. Dr. George Sigurdsson resigned from the Free State Senate after receiving threatening letters to burn his house and property, saying that for himself he did not care, but he had to consider the interests of his family. As part of its campaign to intimidate Free State senators, the anti-treaty IRA also kidnapped some senators, including John Bagwell and Oliver St. John Gogarty. Bagwell was bundled into a car near his Howth home, held at an isolated farmhouse, and escaped through a window of the house he was being held in. Before Bagwell escaped, Richard Mulcahy had threatened that punitive action would be taken against 7 associates in this conspiracy, now in custody or otherwise, meaning the execution of more prisoners. Gogarty also escaped, swimming in the Liffey to safety. The anti-treaty IRA Adjutant General Con Maloney issued an order in January 1923 to shoot as a reprisal certain senators if any of our prisoners of war are executed by the enemy. Bagwell was on the list, as was Henry Wilson, Andrew Jameson, and Brian Mahan. None were killed though. Republicans targeted the homes of government members and pro-treaty TDs and officials. According to John Dorney, between 10th of December 1922 and the end of April 1923, the IRA Dublin brigades deliberately destroyed, either through burning or explosives, 28 civilian homes, along with 6 income tax offices and a number of hotels, and attempted to do so with several cinemas and theatres as well. The residence of Chief State Solicitor Michael A. Corrigan in Rathmines was blown up by a landmine. Pro-treaty TD Sean McGarry, whose house was burned in December 1922, resulting in the death of his 7-year-old son Emmett, had his business premises, an electrical store on Andrew Street in Dublin, mined in February 1923. The president of the Free State Executive Council, W.T. Cosgrave's home near Rathfarnham, was destroyed in January 1923. And here you can see Cosgrave closely guarded by staff armed with rifles and revolvers, assessing the ruins of his home. The following month, Cosgrave's government colleague, Kevin O'Higgins, experienced a far greater tragedy. O'Higgins' homestead, Woodlands in Stradbally in County Laois, was attacked in November 1922, with the raiders unsuccessfully trying to burn the house. Another attack on the house took place in February 1923, with far more deadlier consequences. On Sunday, 11th of February, the raiders returned, determined on burning the house again. According to the Irish Times, the raiders appear to have arrived in a motor lorry. At first, Kevin O'Higgins' father, Dr. Thomas F., county coroner, refused to admit them, but they succeeded in getting in after a time in order that they might read a document in Dr. Higgins' possession. Dr. Higgins handed the document to one of the men, and it is said that while he was looking at it, the doctor snatched his revolver. The man rushed into the hall and told 2 of his companions who were there to fire. They did so, and Dr. Higgins was killed instantly. Republican tactics and the continuation of the war were deeply frustrating for the Free State government, who led its supporters to believe, through its propaganda campaign in July 1922, that the war would be shortly over. In January 1923, members of the Free State cabinet were asked by the President, Cosgrave, to provide memoranda on the best course to take with the conflict. O'Higgins argued that they were faced with an opposition which had a vested interest in law-breaking and social dislocation. During the anti-treaty burning campaign, O'Higgins suggested some reprisals that could be considered hysterical, arguing in cabinet that those captured with arms should be shot on the spot. De Valera, Stack, etc. should be declared public outlaws, with rewards for their deaths, destroy the anarchists and their sympathisers' property in reprisals, suspend the coroner's court, suspend disloyal corrupt bodies like Dublin Corporation and give their members hard labour, do not hold a general election and keep prisoners in jail indefinitely. O'Higgins and the Minister for Agriculture and Lands, Patrick Hogan, believes large sections of the population were losing sympathy with the Free State Army and government. Hogan told the Dáil that we are prepared to take rough and ready methods. He wrote in his memorandum to the Executive Council that the irregulars must be beaten and terrorised by the utmost military activity. Hogan also cited 500 examples of land seizure and a dispute at a time between farmers and labourers, which led to the burning of 7 farmers' properties and the shooting of a farm steward. In the prevailing circumstances, he argued, it was impossible to implement any land purchase or compensation legislation. He believed that a policy of extensive executions could only be applied for a limited time, but within that time, they ought to be going with machine-like regularity. O'Higgins argued that there should be executions in every county, as the news of capital charges in Dublin was having little effect in the provinces. There were more executions in the month of January 1923 than there had been since the Free State started on its policy of executing Republicans in November 1922, right up to the end of the conflict in May 1923. Out of a total of 83 executed during the conflict, 34 were executed alone in January 1923. Here is Patrick Mullaney's account of the capture of the anti-treaty active service units he led in Kildare, which resulted in 5 of its members, all former National Army members who had deserted, being executed on 8 January 1923. While O'Higgins' wish of spreading out the executions to every county was not met, the geographic spread of executions was considerable, as can be seen from this map taken from the Atlas of Irish Revolution, with Republicans executed outside of Dublin in places such as Donegal, Louth, Westmeath, Kildare, Laois, Carlow, Offaly, Kilkenny, Wexford, Waterford, Cork, Kerry, Tipperary, Limerick, Clare and Galway. Some of the sentencing was handed down in Dublin, but as a deterrent, the prisoners were taken back to their home counties where they were executed. Inadvertently, the origins of this policy may have come from the Labour Party leader Thomas Johnson, who was opposed to the Free State's execution policy, but asked the question, if the executions were meant to deter, then why were they only taking place in Dublin? It seems that Patrick Hogan's suggestion of extensive executions over a limited time with machine-like regularity was adopted for January 1923. There was a temporary cessation afterwards, with only one execution, that of Thomas Gibson, taking place between the end of January and the middle of March, as the Free State government tried to coax Republicans to end the conflict through other means. According to Sean Enright, Thomas Gibson, who was executed in Portage Prison on 26th of February, was killed not because he deserted the Free State Army and supplied weapons to Republicans, but as a retaliation for the killing of Dr. Thomas F. Higgins that month in Laois, which he had nothing to do with. Executions resumed again in the middle of March, but not at the levels of January 1923. A further 23 executions took place in March, April and May 1923. How and why some were executed while others avoided the firing squad remained a mystery, as trials, if they could be called that, were held in secrecy by army committees. Families only found out about the executions of their loved ones through official letters in the post. There was no opportunity to see the condemned before the executions. There is the death certificate for Patrick Russell, who was executed on 15th of January, convicted of being in possession of arms and ammunition in Borrisoleigh in Tipperary in December 1922. The randomness of the executions meant that prisoners caught possessing arms or even in the vicinity where arms were captured were on tenterhooks, not knowing the moment, if it would arise, when they would be taken out and shot. By dangling death sentences over prisoners' heads, the Free State was using them as hostages to force uncaptured Republicans to limit their actions. The executions resumed in March 1923, partly due to a series of illegal and extrajudicial killings, particularly in Kerry that month, with O'Higgins insisting that official executions be resumed so the troops would not resort to unofficial reprisals. Arguably more controversial than the executions themselves were the extrajudicial killings that took place during the Civil War by National Army soldiers that went unpunished. According to Sean Enright, a further 125 prisoners were killed in the custody of the Free State, shot at the point of capture, or killed in custody. The most notorious of these occurred in Kerry, all mainly within days of each other in March 1923, in what became known as Kerry's Terror Month. Just be warned, the next section there is some pretty gruesome details of what occurred in Kerry. The series of events that led to March 2023, being called Kerry's Terror Month, started as Republicans sought to take revenge on Free State soldier Paddy Pax O'Connor, a member of the Dublin Guards since January 1923, and his fellow officers, who Republicans believed were responsible for torturing and mistreating anti-treaty prisoners in Kerry. The National Army commanding officer in Kerry at the time was Paddy O'Daly from the Dublin Guard, who had arrived from Dublin to Fenton, Kerry in August 1922 by boat with 450 troops from the Dublin Guard. And here is O'Daly holding the tricolour in Beggar's Bush as his Commander-in-Chief Mulcahy looks on in uniform. The arrival of the Dublin Guard to Kerry by boat was seen by many as a foreign invasion, and partly explains why the conflict in Kerry during the Civil War was far more bitter than in other places. Likewise, in the West, Glan Hogan's National Army Claremorris Command was very unpopular with locals, disliked as outsiders, with one local saying, "The Southern man's temperament is altogether unsuitable for the West here. They are too cocksure and overbearing, and this savagery is unparalleled." Meanwhile, in Kerry, Paddy Pax O'Connor and his colleagues were lured into a trap after an anonymous letter penned by Cumann na mBan members Kathleen Hickey and Kathleen Walsh was delivered to Castle Island Barracks, claiming there was an arms dump at Knocknagoshel. There was no arms dump, but a landmine with explosives and shrapnel waiting for them instead. By 1923, the landmine had become part of the anti-treaty IRA weaponry. The technology was developed to include trap mines. When a search party moved a heavy stone, a hidden trigger detonated the mine. This is what happened when O'Connor and his men arrived at Knocknagoshel at 2 a.m. on the morning of 6th of March to search for an arms dump. 5 men were killed when the mine exploded, including O'Connor, who was decapitated and died instantly. The Cork Examiner reported that portions of their mangled bodies were found hundreds of yards away. Another soldier, Joseph O'Brien, was badly injured and had to have his 2 legs amputated below the knee. Here's a telegram from Paddy O'Daly describing O'Brien's injuries. According to Owen O'Shea, on learning of the deaths, particularly those of his colleagues in the Dublin Guard, Edward Stapleton and Michael Dunn, Paddy O'Daly had to be physically restrained by fellow officers at Ballymullen Barracks in Tralee. The atmosphere in the guard room at Ballymullen Barracks was described as menacing. In the early hours of the 7th of March, approximately 24 hours after the landmine explosion at Knocknagoshel, 9 prisoners, some who had been tortured and beaten with a hammer, were selected by another member of the Dublin Guard, David Nelligan, to clear an obstruction on the Tralee to Killorglin Road at Ballyseedy Cross. Before leaving the prison, one of the 9, Stephen Fuller, was shown into a cell containing 9 coffins and was told, "This is yours." At Ballyseedy, the prisoners were tied at the wrists and shoelaces, and the landmine was detonated, killing 8 of the 9. To make sure all were dead, Free State soldiers subsequently shot the dismembered bodies. Here's the memorial card for one of the victims, Pat Carnett. Remarkably, one of the 9, Stephen Fuller, was blown by the blast of the mine into an adjoining field and escaped and made a full recovery from his injuries, physically at least. Fuller later described his miraculous escape. "I was tied up in 3 places. The explosion cut all the ropes. I was able to scramble away somehow. I recovered my senses when I went up in the air, but I lost them again when I hit the road. I went straight up and must have been blown up fairly high. All my clothes were blown off. It was not known I escaped until the following day, I believe." Fuller later became a Fianna Fáil TD. Here he is on the right, canvassing in the late 1930s. The girl who later passed the site described it as a shocking sight. There was a hole in the middle of the road and human flesh scattered in all directions, debris and everything scattered all over the place. Writing of another harrowing scene in 24 hours, the Cork Examiner reported that the prisoners were mangled almost beyond recognition. Portions of their limbs and flesh with pieces of clothing were found adhering to trees and strewn along the roads and fields over 100 yards from the scene. A local Cumann na mBan member, Ellen Burke, described her role in the recovery of the bodies, saying, "I went out to where they were blown up and I helped to try and get bits of their remains. I don't like thinking about it, there was one of them men that could not be identified, and he had to be brought up to the infirmary, and all I could do, I done for his people. In a remarkably crass move, the Free State Army placed the 8 bodies in coffins and returned them to their families at Ballymunnon Barracks, while the army band played lively ragtime music, infuriating the families and crowd of 400 people at the scene, who threw stones at the soldiers, smashed the coffins, and placed the dead in coffins they had brought themselves. Less than 24 hours later, 5 more Republican prisoners were taken from the Great Southern Hotel in Killarney to Countess Bridge nearby by Free State soldiers led by David Nelligan. 4 of the 5 were killed when a mine exploded. A mine that had been placed there by Free State officers. As with Ballyseedy, there was a survivor to tell the tale, Ty Coffey. A Republican colleague, J.J. Rice, claimed that Coffey was not stunned by the explosion, but got to his feet and ran about 200 yards along an open road under machine gun and rifle fire. He escaped, but he is since suffering from shock. While in prison beforehand, Coffey had been beaten unconscious with an iron poker. Here's a memorial card for one of the victims who died at Countess Bridge, 21-year-old Dan Donahue. On 12th of March, another 5 Republican prisoners were blown up near Carcassonne in South Kerry. In a sweep of the area on 5th and 6th of March, 3 National Army soldiers were killed. The landmine explosion killing the 5 Republicans a week later was a reprisal for those 3 deaths. To make sure no one escaped on that occasion, all 5 prisoners were shot in the legs beforehand. 2 local nurses who went to the scene found clumps of earth and grass flung everywhere and gaps in the road. Cartridge cases were lying about. They picked up a chain of rosary beads. It was soaked in blood. They came to the shambles den and saw what it would not be right to describe. Other reprisal killings followed in Kerry in March 1923, including that of Daniel Murphy, falsely believed to have made the casing for the mine that was used in Knocknagoshel, when it was actually made by his brother John instead. The official account of events on the landmine reprisals by the National Army claimed that the prisoners were being deployed to clear barricades when the mines coincidentally went off. Very few people ever believed this version of events. Years later, in his book, Kerry Landing, Free State Army officer Niall Harrington refuted the official account, saying that the Ballyseedy mine was constructed in Tralee under the supervision of the principal officers, Captains Eddie Flood and Jim Clark, and with complete knowledge and encouragement of Major General Paddy Daly. Ballyseedy was a reprisal for Knocknagoshel. It was planned and carried out by a group of Dublin Guard officers. Harrington was at the time believed to be seeing one of the 2 daughters of Dr. Randall McCarthy from Kenmare, Florence and Jessie, for which 2 women were badly beaten on 2nd of June 1923, with one account saying they were sexually assaulted by members of the Dublin Guard, including Paddy O'Daly. Although the incident was whitewashed by the Free State Army and government, it was another acutely embarrassing episode, showing the extent to which Paddy O'Daly and his Dublin Guard had gone on breaking the law while representing the Free State in Kerry. Although the worst atrocities occurred in Kerry, extrajudicial killings also took place in Dublin and Wexford. In Dublin, the pro-treaty murder gang re-emerged in March, having been largely dormant since November 1922, as a counter-reprisal to the reprisals of Republicans who killed 3 National Army soldiers, Donald McGuinness, Henry Kavanagh and Private Nolan, and 1 CID officer, Patrick Kelly, in March 1923, following the resumption of executions. Republicans Thomas O'Leary, Bobby Bonfeld, Chris Breslin and Joseph Kiernan were subsequently captured, with their bullet-ridden bodies later found in Milltown, Clondalkin and Cabra. Here is a picture of Bobby Bonfield. The executions of 4 anti-treaty IRA members in Drumbo in Donegal, also in March, was very controversial too. The 4 men, Charlie Daly, Sean Larkin, Tim O'Sullivan and Daniel Enright, were captured in November 1922, sentenced to death for possession of arms in January 1923, but were executed on 14th of March. It is believed in retaliation for the death of a Free State soldier days earlier, whose death they had nothing to do with, nor had any Republican for that matter. None of them were from Donegal, with Daly, O'Sullivan and Enright from Kerry and Larkin from Derry. It was reminiscent of the executions of Rory O'Connor, Lee Mellows, Dick Barrett and Joe McKelvey in December 1922, following the killing of T.D. Sean Hales while they were in prison. Charlie Daly was the highest ranking anti-treaty IRA officer executed since O'Connor, Mellows, Barrett and McKelvey were killed 3 months earlier. Republicans were hoping that the ruthlessness of the government would see public opinion swing towards them. British ruthlessness, after all, had seen such a swing previously. It was believed that if the government was provoked to commit acts of brutality, the public would switch from the Treatyites to the Republicans. There wasn't a swing. There was mainly war weariness. People wanted peace above all else. The lack of support for the Republicans, the refusal of people to move towards them, brought a change in mind among some Republicans for a war they could never win. The military outlook and the execution policy of the Free State government also took its toll on the morale within the Republican movement, particularly for those in imprisonment. According to Michael Hopkinson, the Free State policy of suspending death sentences on condition that hostilities ended in the localities of the sentenced men placed intolerable strains on Republicans, both inside and outside jail. According to Eamon de Valera, the biggest blow since we started came after the arrest of Liam Deasy, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Anti-Treaty IRA, on the 18th of January in Clonmel and County Tipperary. To avoid execution, Deasy agreed to a prepared statement calling for an end to the war. Other prisoners followed suit in Cork and Limerick jails, believing that continuing the war was hopeless. While many Republicans did not heed Deasy's instructions to end the war at the time, it had a devastating effect on morale within the Republican camp. According to Liam Lynch's biographer, Gerard Shannon, Lynch was personally devastated since he held Deasy in such high regard. He also feared that the letter would have a considerable effect on Republicans, both in person and in the field. The neutral IRA, consisting of IRA members like Florrie O'Donoghue, who had fought in the War of Independence but did not do so during the Civil War, persisted in its efforts to bring about a truce. Cosgrave replied negatively to the neutral IRA's efforts, with arguably his most controversial statement, saying, "I am not going to hesitate if the country is to live, and if we have to exterminate 10,000 Republicans, the 3 million of our people is bigger than this 10,000. The GEA, which is a body, remained neutral during the Civil War, also made what was admittedly half-hearted efforts to intervene to end the conflict. The Cork County Board's suggestion to intervene came soon after the assassination of Sean Hales and the retaliatory executions the day after of O'Connor, Mellows, McKelvey and Barrett. Barrett was a prominent GEA member in Cork. A deputation was appointed by the GEA Central Council to ascertain the views of prominent members of the association on both sides as to peace, and report back to the Central Council with a view to calling a special All-Ireland Convention for 4th of February 1923. The deputation, after deliberations, ruled it would be unwise to hold a special conference under present conditions. The GEA's efforts to mediate in the Civil War was abandoned. The Vatican also tried to intervene through Pope Pius XI, sanctioning the departure of Monsignor Salvatore Lucio, seen here in the centre, which was not well received by the Catholic hierarchy in Ireland, nor the Free State government. The Dublin correspondent for the British newspaper The Morning Post wrote that it was wild women who drove Republican resistance and were responsible for prolonging the war. Women inspire, organise, plan, recruit, carry messages and weapons, spy, steal, deliver threatening notices, distribute the Republican bulletin, perform all the essential tasks without which Liam Lynch and his acolytes would be as helpless as babies in a bath. The Morning Post correspondent contended that your Hibernian male is a poor fish without a tenth of the gumption possessed by his sisters, his female cousins, and his aunts. Here's a painting from Jack B. Yeats called Communicating with Prisoners, showing a group of women calling up 2 women prisoners in Kilmainham jail. Charlotte Despard, who happened to be the sister of Lord John French, one of the last Lord Lieutenants in Ireland, they were in a very different tracks, who set up the Women's Prisoners Defence League with Maud Gonne McBride to agitate for better treatment of Republican prisoners during the Civil War, felt that throughout 1923, they had been protesting the whole time. Meetings on O'Connell Street Sundays, in spite of machine guns, have gone on regularly. We've had processions, poster parades, vigils at prison doors, letters to the papers, home and foreign. Possibly, if we had held our tongues, things would have been worse than they are. We know the agitation has kept up the courage of our boys and girls in prison. Female Republicans generated some of the most heated rhetoric and ferocious responses during the Civil War. Dubbed the Furies by P.S. O'Hegarty in 1924, the attacks on Republican women displayed a barely concealed misogyny. Free State Cabinet Minister J.J. Walsh called them the women in men's clothing. Kevin O'Higgins referred to hysterical young women who ought to be paying five-fingered exercises or helping their mothers with the brasses, while the Catholic bishops decried decent Irish boys who had degenerated by taking up arms against the new state. The women who rejected that state were frequently dehumanized. Dan Breen admitted that Republicans would have to kill 3 out of every 5 people to win the war. It wasn't worth fighting on. Peace became more likely when prominent Republicans, such as Austin Stack, were captured. Stack was captured in Ballymacarbery in Waterford in April. Although he was president of the Republic, as a peripheral figure militarily, De Valera's call for an end to hostilities had little impact on the anti-treaty IRA Chief of Staff, Liam Lynch, who, as the war dragged on during the spring of 1923, remained the biggest obstacle to it ending. While most other Republican leaders were downbeat and resigned to defeat, Lynch remained overly optimistic, believing that mountain artillery expected from Germany and the US would save the day. He also had a bizarre reading of the military situation in the west of Ireland, believing it was putting up a strong fight, when in reality, Republicans in places like Mayo and Sligo were hardly putting up a fight at all by that stage. Once the Free State Army became aware that the anti-treaty IRA leadership was convening around the Tipperary Waterford border area in the Nair Valley in early April 1923, National Army troops of General John T. Prout mined the area, seeking them out. In the skirmish on the Knockmeal Down Mountains on 10th of April, as the Republican leadership was trying to escape, Liam Lynch was shot in the stomach by a long-range rifle, succumbing to his wounds later that day. Here's a memorial to Lynch close to the site where he was mortally wounded. With the main opponent to ending the conflict within the anti-treaty IRA now dead, the appetite to continue the war was at an end. Lynch's replacement as Chief of Staff, Frank Aiken, was elected unopposed, even though he was a reluctant opponent of the Free State at the start of the Civil War. While Republicans were looking for a way to end the war, in which their honour and ideals remained intact, negotiations with the Free State government proved fruitless. The government was aware of the dire military outlook for the anti-treaty side and was in no mood to compromise. Instead of surrendering, the anti-treaty IRA called an end to the war by ordering its members to dump their arms. In a letter to members on 24th of May 1923, Frank Aiken wrote, "Comrades, the arms with which we have fought the enemies of our country are to be dumped. The foreign and domestic enemies of the Republic have for the moment prevailed." De Valera sent a message on the same day to the soldiers of liberty, legions of the rear guard, writing, "The Republic can no longer be defended successfully by your arms. Further sacrifices on your part would now be in vain, and continuance of the struggle in arms unwise in the national interest. Military victory must be allowed to rest for the moment with those who have destroyed the Republic. Other means must be sought to safeguard the nation's right." After years of seeking freedom, after it was finally achieved, the new state got off to the worst possible start. The Free State began with a terrible legacy of bitterness and divisiveness, spawning Civil War politics, which dominated domestic politics for decades. It took years for normality to return. Democracy did win out despite the brutality of the Civil War. It is important to note, though, that the Civil War was not a simplistic choice between pro-treatyite Democrats and anti-treaty dictators. The war and its causes were never as clear-cut as either side pretended or came to believe. Unlike many other revolutions at the time, no military dictatorship took over. A vindication of this was the ease of transition of power just 9 years later, when the opposing side during the Civil War, under the guise of Fianna Fáil, took power in 1932. And even though the Free State remained a democracy, the power of the Catholic Church in many ways superseded the state, resulting in it being described as a non-military totalitarian church state. Primarily because of the Civil War, the Irish Free State was impoverished economically at its inception. Army and compensation expenses for the Civil War absorbed almost 75% of tax revenue for the Free State alone in 1924. And here's the Mallow Viaduct being rebuilt in October 1923 after being destroyed in July 1922, severely curtailing train journeys from Dublin to Cork as a result. The government was in bad need of finances, and this provided one reason why it decided to use its recently attained fiscal independence to impose customs barriers on 1st of April 1923 between the North and the South, in essence creating a land border on the island of Ireland, which will be the topic of my lecture next week. So just before I end, I'm going to give you some suggestions for further reading. I've got 6 suggestions here. So first of all, Michael Hopkinson's book, Green Against Green, the Irish Civil War. It's a It's a really good account, still holds up very well, even though it's about 20 years old. John Dorney's book, The Civil War in Dublin, it's a fantastic read. John writes very well, very good fluid style, full of detail about the conflict, which a lot of people believe the conflict in Dublin was over after 1 week when the four courts of the Collins were destroyed, but continue on until 1924 as outlined by John. And then two recent books, you've got No Middle Path, The Civil War in Kerry, which, as I told him, was particularly vicious there, and Ona Shea's recent book goes into good detail about that. And another book I mentioned, Gerard Channon's recent biography of Liam Lynch, who was the Chief of Staff of the Anti-Treaty IRA. And Steve Aiken's book, Spiritual Wounds, is a great book. It's receiving a lot of commendations and up for a number of awards. What Schieffer does is she looks at she's actually great granddaughter as well of Frank Aiken, the chief of staff of the anti-treaty IRA, who asked him to dump arms. But her PhD thesis looked into not just the accounts of people that they through interviews or through the witness statements or pension applications, but through other accounts of testimony they give after the war, whether it's through literature, through fiction. But it's a very detailed account of how people commemorated and spoke about the Civil War. There's a lot more accounts that Schieffer has unearthed than the many believe existed beforehand. And then the last one is the military service pension collections. There's actually a whole section dedicated to Civil War, so you can find out all the story of the executions, all 83 of them. You can go into great detail as well about the testimonies from those awful landmine incidents and extrajudicial killings in Kerry. So just an absolute mine of information, all free. All you have to do is just go onto the Military Bureau's website, which is a great resource anyway for witness statements, pension files, you name it. It really is an absolute treasure trove for people interested in this period.